If you don't know me, my name is Stuart King, and I'm leading our ARC project on world crime fiction and the global challenges of the 21st century. The concepts of crime and fiction are important in the Australian context. The country's foundational crime is the violent dispossession, historical and ongoing, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the foundational fiction that underpinned that crime is the legal doctrine of terra nullius, that is, that there was no one here before the British arrived. As such, I acknowledge the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we meet today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to Monash Dr. Rachel Fetherston. And I say welcome back because Rachel completed her undergraduate degrees here with honours in English back in the day. And Rachel reminded me last year that I actually was one of her honours examiners. Now, Rachel is a lecturer in writing and literature in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University, not too far from here. And her research is concerned with posthumanism, popular genre, particularly crime fiction and science fiction, climate fiction and eco-fiction, and post-colonial cultures and ecologies. She's currently working on a monograph contracted with Palgrave Macmillan on the representation of the more than human in Australian eco-fiction. She is Vice President, Australia, of the Association for the Study of Literature, Environment and Culture, Australia and New Zealand, co-convener of the Reading and Screening, the Fantastique Research Network, and board secretary for Remember the Wild, an Australian charity focused on connecting people with nature. Now, Rachel's talk today is titled Seeking Greener Pages, an exploration of reader response to drought and the non-human in Australian crime fiction. Please make her welcome.
Is that better? Oh, yeah. Definitely hear me, I hope. Thank you so much for the introduction, Stuart. And yeah, it's really nice to be back on the Clayton campus after doing my undergrad here and my honours here. So thank you so much for having me. Like Stuart, I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters here today, the Boonwurrung people and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and also recognise that sovereignty of these lands and waters has never been ceded. So yeah, thank you for joining me today. Thank you to people online. Hopefully, yeah, this paper is about crime fiction, of course, but it does stem from my PhD work, which had crime fiction as a smaller portion of it. So I'm sort of in the process of trying to connect this work a little bit more with crime fiction than it was previously. Hopefully that comes through, but we'll see how we go. So in their work on how narratives help audiences think differently about other species, Wojciech Malecki and colleagues refer to the narrative turn within academia and its proliferation of research that addresses how, quote, moral intuitions often yield to narrative persuasion. In other words, many scholars are currently asking the question of whether narratives can persuade readers to reconsider their own moral beliefs. So this presentation today follows a similar trajectory, I guess, in its discussion of the results and possible implications of a reader study that was part of my PhD that investigated how readers respond to works of Australian eco-fiction that portray the non-human, such as animals, plants, climates, including drought in a local Australian context. So today I'm going to focus on the results, as I said, that relate specifically to crime fiction, surprise, surprise, and some of the drought-related responses that came through in this reader study, with a particular emphasis on two Australian crime novels, Jane Harper's The Dry and Chris Hammer's Scrublands. So The Dry came out in 2016, Scrublands in 2018, and of course since then we've had film adaptation with Eric Banner of The Dry, which some of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with. And also, I think, more recently, TV adaptations of Scrublands and the other books in Hammer's crime series. So both of these novels, I believe, are concerned with the relationship between drought and crime. Different portrayals of place and violence in these crime novels evoked strong responses from readers in the survey regarding their own relationships with place and how drought impacts both people and environments. Before continuing, and I guess I've already pointed this out as this being a portion of my PhD study, which my PhD was conferred back in 2022, so I'm definitely milking it for all it's worth by still presenting on it. But I'm hoping to sort of expand this research into a newer project, and I thought this was a really great forum to, I guess, get people's thoughts and feedback on it if I do expand it into a more crime fiction focused work. But I also wanted to just recognise that some of the research I'm discussing today has been previously published in a co-authored article alongside my PhD supervisors, who were Emily Potter and Kelly Miller of Deakin University and Devon Bowles of ANU, who contributed in a lot of ways to the study design and also partly to this reframing of the study in crime fiction terms. So yeah, as I said, I decided to present this research today in an even more crime fiction focused way, as I'm interested in expanding on this reader response work in the near future with a particular focus or more of a focus on crime fiction. Much of my research since my PhD has been more focused on what we'd probably call traditional literary studies research and less so on the surveying aspect. But the results that I'll discuss today, I think, highlight the importance of bringing together hermeneutic literary studies research with reader response studies of this nature to understand how certain texts influence, if at all, readers' environmental attitudes and possibly behaviours. The focus on crime fiction in particular stems from a desire to understand the influence of popular crime fiction, particularly Australian crime fiction, but as I've indicated, has since grown into a broader project that I'm currently developing to understand how Australian crime fiction engages with ecological concerns by both endorsing and deconstructing the rural-urban binary, which I won't be talking about a whole lot today. I mean, I'll be talking about the rural a little bit today, but I won't so much be talking about this side of the project. But that's what I'm currently developing at the moment, particularly comparing that binary in Australian crime fiction with how it's represented in other post-colonial crime fictions, such as Irish and US crime fiction. So this reader study sits partly within the emerging field of empirical eco-criticism, which some of you may be familiar with. This is defined by Matthew Schneider-Mason and colleagues as, quote, combining social scientific methodologies with the kind of textual analysis that has long been the métier of eco-criticism. In many ways, it's a response to this question put by Schneider-Mason, which is how do the assumptions and intuitions of eco-critics align with empirical evidence about what environmentally engaged narratives do when they encounter flesh and blood readers? Or in the context of this study and these texts, how do readers respond, or how do readers' responses to Australian eco-crime fiction align with or don't align with eco-critical assumptions about the representation of nature and the non-human in these texts? The results of this study that I'm talking about today perhaps provide a means for eco-critics to better understand and even reconsider their own readings of these same or similar narratives. So I identify Australian eco-fiction as a genre because it exhibits certain tropes that are expected by the reader. Australian eco-fiction encompasses speculative and science fiction, crime fiction, and realist fiction, amongst other forms, and includes what I think to be more popular genre texts as well as more literary texts. Some common tropes of Australian eco-fiction include the portrayal of the present and future impacts of anthropogenic climate change, environmental activism, environmental exploitation such as logging, mining, and farming, at least the kind of settler colonial farming that was brought to Australia by the British, the depiction of various non-humans, and an exploration of human-non-human relationships. So these characteristics can be applied to the conceptualisation of eco-fiction on a more global level as well. But Australian eco-fiction, I believe, is defined by an engagement with different kinds of non-human that are specific to the local Australian context. So that might be native habitats, for example, the impact of colonisation on these places, as well as on people, of course. Environmental phenomena such as flood, drought and bushfires that are particularly pertinent in an Australian context, and often this question or this challenge to settler colonial belonging, particularly in a time of climate crisis. What also makes the exploration of these tropes uniquely Australian are the links drawn between environmental themes and, as I've said, Australian settler coloniality in these texts. And for those of you who are familiar with these texts, you'll know that it's difficult to read these or to see the adaptations of them without taking into consideration the impacts of settler colonialism on the places and the environments that are depicted here. Some common tropes of Australian settler colonial literature include the depiction of the domination of environments and of Indigenous peoples, an emphasis on the settler coloniser, whether as an early settler or a more contemporary form of white non-Indigenous inhabitant, as a kind of hero or heroine fighting for belonging in a place that they think is difficult to fully know or understand, and the marginalisation or often exclusion entirely of Indigenous Australian characters, which is definitely the case with these two texts. Other tropes also include a focus on settler colonial human action and endeavour, with the non-human world rendered either as a threat to overcome or as a passive and agency-less background. So you're probably wondering where crime fiction comes into this. So obviously I'm talking specifically about Australian crime fiction under this umbrella of Australian eco-fiction today. So throughout the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to refer to, I guess, this subset of Australian eco-fiction as Australian eco-crime fiction. So while it's of course not unusual for Australian crime texts to take place in Australian places and Australian environments, I argue that there are many texts, notably many that have been published over the past decade, certainly many since The Dry has been published in 2016, establishing or kind of almost like re-establishing this outback noir genre that's become very, very popular in recent years, that engage with environmental themes that go beyond the environment as mere setting, as I'll go on to describe a little bit later if I get time. So the term eco-crime might be a little bit misleading here, and it's worth exploring this briefly. So I guess eco-crimes often used to refer to crimes committed against or with some strong connection to the environment, such as oil spills, illegal logging, animal cruelty, or the climate crisis itself as a crime facilitated by capitalist and settler colonial systems of domination. Here I use the term a little more broadly to also encapsulate crime fiction that depicts intrahuman crimes that happen within this broader context of climate and ecological crisis, even if that's not explicitly mentioned in the text. So a climate crisis is a crisis that has and will continue to exacerbate conflict, criminality and violence amongst humans as the impacts worsen. As I've discussed previously in an analysis of the representation of the non-human in these texts, this genre has long depicted, quote, the troubling relationship between intrahuman violence and the treatment of the non-human. So the connection between human crime and the more than human, as elucidated in novels like these, speaks to the possibilities within such genre texts of speaking to audiences about environmental issues in broad and accessible ways, I think. The texts chosen for this study, Jane Harper's The Dry and Chris Hammer's Scrublands, both endorse and partly challenge some of the long-standing and problematic tropes that centralise the non-Indigenous Australian quest for assured place and control over an unpredictable environment, which might sound a little bit weird because I've sort of just set up these texts as being very much within a contemporary kind of settler colonial Australian literature, but I'll explain sort of what I mean now. So there's been a notable consciousness amongst Australian fiction works published within the last 10 to 15 years, which highlights the threat of the climate crisis to Australian humans and non-humans, by citing ecological devastation that is a result of the nation's still largely colonial logic. Such a logic invokes the colonial claim to stolen Indigenous lands and waters and the resulting exploitation of these places through large-scale resource extraction, which can be linked to local ecological impacts as well as the climate crisis through associated carbon emissions. Relatedly, many Australian eco-crime texts in this same period diverge a little bit, or it's in some cases a lot, depending on what you're reading, from the perspective of the Australian natural world as this sort of unforgiving alien place in need of taming by the colonisers, which is a common trope of a lot of Australian settler colonial literature. And they often depict such a relationship as actually very problematic, or trying to shift this narrative to instead reflect a more nuanced connection between the settler coloniser and surrounding habitats. And I argue here, and also in other work, that the dry and scrublands, compared to a lot of ecofiction texts, aren't necessarily explicitly doing this, but I guess I argue that they're implicitly doing this by actually being attentive to drought, flood, bushfires, and the connection between these things and crime, okay? That being said, though, at the same time, these texts also perpetuate a lot of problematic settler colonial views of the natural environment. But as I've said, they do this through the lens of drought as an ecological catastrophe, okay? Not just necessarily as a setting for the crime. I think they kind of do both, actually. For this reason, I've identified Australian eco-crime fiction as a genre or a subgenre of Australian eco-fiction that is worth investigating in terms of its potential to engage readers with ecological perspectives. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the methodology for the study, which hopefully isn't too sort of social sciencey. The original study conducted called for participants who'd read at least one of 6 selected works of Australian eco-fiction. Now, as I said, this was part of my PhD project, and this selection of texts, which I won't go into detail about, but it actually aligned with the texts I was doing my own close readings on. So in this larger project, I guess I took the findings from the broader reader response study and talked about them alongside my own close readings and did a bit of a comparison, which I don't have time to do today. And obviously I'm focusing specifically on the crime fiction texts, but I just thought it was worth highlighting where these texts sat in relation to the other ones. So that's the list of them there. So recruitment of study participants was achieved through a variety of networks, including some scholarly organisations and networks. And so some participants did end up being scholars, not necessarily literary studies scholars. I'm not sure necessarily what their fields of expertise were, but there were some who identified themselves as academics or as scholars, but a lot of them who didn't as well, as will become obvious. The overall sample consisted of 103 participants who identified themselves as regular readers of Australian fiction broadly. But the group of survey participants discussed today is limited to those who responded to the 2 crime texts, the dry and scrublands. That being said, though, there was an overwhelming number of survey respondents who chose to respond to these texts anyway. I think it was just under 75%. So we're still looking at a somewhat decent number of people out of those 103 participants who read the crime texts compared to the other works. So this means that, yeah, most of the qualitative responses I'm going to talk about today are concerned, or all of them that I'm talking about today are concerned with eco-crime fiction. And one of the reasons I'd like to conduct a similar study in future is because I'd like to target it specifically perhaps to general crime readers rather than just readers of Australian fiction or readers of Australian eco-fiction. Which is not, and as will become obvious when I show you the kinds of questions that were asked, they weren't really encouraging readers to talk specifically about crime elements. And so that's something I'd really like to do in future, is to really focus in on this crime fiction element of the original study, and of course expand it to other texts as well, because I'm very aware that the dry and scrublands are a very particular kind of Australian crime text that isn't representative of other works. So for those who aren't familiar, the dry introduces us to federal police agent Aaron Falk, who returns to his drought-stricken hometown of Kaiwara I think it's supposed to be in Victoria, to mourn the death of an old friend and his family, who's supposed to have, the friend Luke is supposed to have killed his own family and then killed himself. But then, of course, things become much more complicated, and Aaron gets roped into trying to solve, who actually killed this family. Scrublands tells the story of Martin Scarsden, who's a veteran journalist who visits another drought-stricken town, this time a New South Wales town of Riversend in the Riverina, in an attempt to tell the story of a mass shooting that occurred there 1 year prior, discovering that the real truth behind the shooting is yet to be uncovered. And I don't really have time to go into the full plots. You might not be super interested in them, or you might already be familiar with them, particularly with the dry, but that's kind of a general overview of them. So many of the organisations and channels through which participants were recruited were literary in nature, as I've already kind of indicated in terms of sort of the scholarly nature, but also they were literary in nature. As could be predicted using Michelle Kelly and colleagues' discussion of an Australian reading class, this method may have restricted to this study to a certain kind of reader, those who typically read literary fiction and serious non-fiction rather than genre fiction, and those who are often more engaged with broader literary consumption in Australia. For example, people who attend writers' festivals, they might have their own book club, and they might read, book reviews in the newspaper, for example. So investigating the reading practices and responses of this study's participants is therefore mostly an exploration of crime fiction readers, but I guess crime fiction readers, I can't say 100% that these readers read crime fiction more broadly, or if they're people who just read a lot of Australian fiction and happen to have read these crime texts. And it's also important to note that any conclusions that I draw in this presentation today about readers' feelings regarding nature or the non-human or drought or anything like that are quite possibly coming from readers who might already be engaged with ecological discourse in some way. So I'm definitely not claiming that these people who responded, aren't aware of environmental issues or anything like that. So I'm not going to read out all these questions, don't worry, but participants had to respond to a range of demographic questions such as around age, gender and education, which I'll briefly highlight the results of that shortly. But they also had to respond to these open-ended discussion questions, which prompted participants to reflect on particular aspects of their chosen text. So if a participant answered yes to any of these questions, they were then invited to explain their response further. So I won't read them all out, but the ones that are, I guess, relevant to what I'm going to discuss today is the one that talks about natural places. So the third one down, did the text portrayal of natural places make you feel a particular way? If yes, please describe this feeling. And also, were there any particular descriptions of or events regarding animals, plants, or natural places that prompted this feeling? If yes, what were they? And then also, did the text's portrayal of animals and their relationships with human characters resonate with you? If yes, please describe in what way. And I will say that the phrasing used in some of these survey questions is something that I would certainly revise if and when I do redo a similar survey in future. In particular, I think the use of natural places, I mean, it might be handy because it is a little bit of a broad term, so readers can kind of approach it in the way that they want. But also, I'm not sure if it's really 100% the right kind of term to use. And I think the reason for this relates to the key differences between conceptualizations of nature and place. So place is inherently performative and is constituted through interventions and encounters of and between humans and non-humans, while the concept of nature is well problematized in eco-critical scholarship and is not a straightforward opposition to culture. The term is deployed here to reference non-human material agents that constitute environments, an agency that precedes human engagement. So the concept of natural places is potentially ambivalent. However, in the context in this survey, it was deployed as alternative terminology for things like habitats or environments to maybe try and see what people made of this term natural places, whether they thought more about, say, like townships or farms, or whether they thought more about like forest, bush, oceans, whatever related was particularly represented in the text they were talking about. Additionally, and in more specific relation to crime fiction here, I argue that crime fiction, whether set in a stereotypical wilderness setting or not, whether depicting crimes against or involving the environment or not, is inherently concerned with ecology because of its concern with place. At the heart of this is the idea that it's exceedingly difficult to distinguish crime fiction's emphasis on place and environment from other socio-political concerns, such as racial and gender-based violence and discrimination, decolonisation, and global economic uncertainties. All places are political in nature, particularly given, as described by Stuart King, actually, when drawing on the work of Philip Howell, quote, that access to specific places is often policed, leading to exclusions and inclusions, to the creation of groups who don't belong, those who are out of place, and those that belong. Thomas Heiss evokes a similar sentiment in his discussion of time and space in crime fiction, arguing that while the, quote, rendering of space in crime fiction may appear abstract on the surface, quote, every chalk outline signifies and yet conceals a story about the struggle over the meaning of lived spaces in the city. So that's talking specifically about the city, but I think this idea can similarly be applied to the text that I'm talking about today. So I'm just going to briefly acknowledge the demographic results of the participant group, but most of my discussion will focus on the qualitative responses. And it should also be noted that participants' responses were anonymous, and selected quotes discussed here are reported verbatim with any identifying, well, I should say any identifying information removed, but the one way that I was able to identify them in research reporting on this is via their occupation and the state they live in, just because it makes it a bit easier to track if somebody has given more than one quote about a particular text to see if it's the same person or not. So you'll hear me refer to them via their occupations most of the time. So the eco-crime reader group, I'm not going to go through all these stats, but I think it's worth noting that it primarily consisted of people who identified as female, so about 87%, and were aged 35 to 44. That was about 34% of people, and 45 to 54 years, which was about 23% of people. Participants were located across all Australian states and territories except for the Northern Territory, with the majority, about 64%, residing in Victoria, which is most likely due to the recruitment strategy being primarily focused in this state where I was undertaking the research. Most participants had either an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree as their highest qualifications, which actually fits with Michelle Kelly and colleagues' description of those within that Australian reading class that I mentioned before as typically possessing a tertiary education. So I also asked students why they read their selected text or how they were made aware of it. Many participants had read one of the texts because they'd either read a review of it or a friend or family member had recommended it to them. Most of the eco-crime readers selected The Dry as the text they had read. I mean, in many ways, this survey ended up being a survey of people who'd read The Dry at the end of the day. So that was 87% of people had read The Dry, with the remaining eco-crime readers, 13% had read and were responding to questions about Scrublands. This is perhaps not surprising, given both the national and worldwide popularity of Harper's text when compared to Scrublands. And this survey was also undertaken a few years ago. I think it was the year that maybe the film was coming out or just before. So there was certainly a lot of buzz around the novel and the film. So it's not particularly surprising that a lot of people were interested in it. So now I'm going to shift focus to the qualitative responses, which is, I guess, the interesting part, finally. So the results indicated that participants were most likely to respond to the question regarding the depiction of natural places in their selected text, which I pointed out before. So that question, did the text's portrayal of natural places make you feel a particular way? The places depicted in many of these texts can be defined, I mean, perhaps as native Australian habitats, although ones that certainly have large cultural capital and have been, co-opted by settler colonial culture, such as, the ubiquitous bush of outback Australia. Although many, such as farming landscapes and townships, may be viewed more as a product of human and colonial intervention than like natural places. So this prevalence of place and habitat in participants' responses was determined using thematic coding analysis, which I won't bore you with now, but it just helped me group the responses together. So I've got some examples here of how I was grouping them. So if people were talking about native habitats, if they were talking about things like drought, bushfire or floods, if they were talking about a specific place, so this person here mentioned Mudgee in particular in their reading of the dry and identifying that place in the descriptions of that are within the dry. Depiction of animals, absence of the depiction of animals, which I set up as a separate category because as I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, this was quite a major finding. And climate change, which is down the bottom because not many people remarked on climate change, which I mean isn't surprising. It's not really explicitly mentioned, I don't think, at any point in Scrublands in the dry. At least the term climate change I don't think is, but it is implied, is what I would argue. And this person here, I think that's quite a significant quote, particularly in the context of crime fiction, that they've mentioned both climate change and domestic violence in the same sentence there. So the affective component of attitudes was especially represented in readers' responses, as many participants described how certain depictions of the non-human made them feel. As will be demonstrated by readers of the dry, the stifling feeling pertaining to a drought-ridden rural farming community was one of the most common reactions described by readers in the study. But some participants also commented on feelings of nostalgia regarding their own experiences of similar places. For example, a communications director from Victoria described Harper's depiction of the Australian landscape in the dry as reminiscent of their, quote, own experience of wheatbelt towns. Similarly, a historian from New South Wales, quote, found the description of the landscape and environment to be absolutely compelling and authentic. I've spent too much time in areas just as oppressive and stark. Despite the often negative feelings towards the inhospitable setting of the dry, some readers saw positives in Harper's descriptions of country life. For example, a public servant from Victoria reflected on how, quote, it felt free and light to be reading a book set in the country. The space, the fresh air reminded me of my childhood. A communications advisor from New South Wales wrote that the dry made them feel, quote, inspired to spend more time in the country and proud of the landscapes we have in Australia, which I thought was quite a surprising response in many ways, given the very violently tragic themes of the novel and the tense political climate that often surrounds the issue of drought in Australia. So these kinds of responses, I think, indicate that depictions of these landscapes and their relationship to surrounding natural, non-human elements plays a key role in engaging the reader with their own experience of place, and therefore also their approach to crime in the text, which again wasn't specifically asked of them in the questions, so not many of them were necessarily reflecting on that specifically. But I do think it's interesting that some responses, for example, the one I read out before, I've spent too much time in areas such as just as oppressive and stark. They're not specifically mentioning crime, but there's sort of an allusion there to the oppressive nature of the text, given the violent themes of it. Whereas this kind of response is entirely missing that kind of commentary about the oppressiveness of the text and of the events in the text and the setting. So there's obviously different ways that people have approached the representation of place in these novels. Thinking about the selected texts as regionally specific, which is something Matthew Schneider-Mason has also written about, is potentially a productive means of understanding the impacts of Australian eco-crime fiction. Some readers, such as a PhD student from Victoria, picked up on the geographical specificity of some of the texts, stating, quote, "I think the strength of The Dry and the reason for its success is its depiction of a really specific Australian landscape and performative geography linked to that landscape and psyche. It's not quintessential Australia, and that's why it works so well." These varying descriptions of personal connection to place were also seen amongst respondents in a study done by Matthew Schneider-Mason of climate fiction readers, suggesting that a reader's response to a text may relate strongly to the places where they've actually grown up, lived, or even visited briefly. As Schneider-Mason emphasises in the context of climate fiction, the consideration of spatial distance is important. So he writes, "We might conclude from this that the geographical setting matters a great deal because it can capitalise on spatial proximity or potentially decrease spatial distance. Readers may be more likely to find diegetic events believable or realistic if they identify with the work's setting, which speaks to the value of regionally specific eco-fiction." And I guess this kind of finding might seem a little bit obvious. It's like, of course, if you've lived in a place or had experience of a place and you read a text that evokes similar portrayals or sentiments around that place, then you're probably going to identify with that more when you're asked questions about it. But I do think it's interesting, particularly in the context of climate fiction, what this might mean in terms of reading more locally, regionally specific climate fiction as having a different kind of effect than fiction that might be a little bit more broadly representational. However, one criticism that has been made of Australia's outback noir genre, which some of you are possibly familiar with, is its tendency to depict this kind of every town of rural Australia, rather than being specifically attentive to particular places. Both The Dry and Scrublands are guilty of this to some extent, especially given the similar ways in which drought seems to affect both places. So this is often indicated throughout both texts by dry riverbeds, declining local economies marked by closing businesses, and the tendency towards violence within communities affected by drought. While such things shouldn't be ignored as possibly quite real consequences of drought in Australia, the reader's comments that The Dry highlights a really specific Australian landscape, as they said, seems to be a little at odds with the idea that actually a lot of these crime texts do tend to depict one very generalisable Australian landscape, which is often the Australian rural outback township. Survey responses often emphasised either human place over nature in the text or the natural world over human place, in terms of which resonated with the participant the most. For example, a sessional teacher from Victoria noted the depiction of crops, livestock and people in The Dry, indicating that the agricultural environment of the text resonated with them strongly, although they also mentioned that the dry nature of the land as a whole resonated strongly as well. Comparatively, a housewife from Victoria suggested that the sublimity of the described natural setting of The Dry was registered by readers as opposed to human places and environment. So they specifically mentioned things from The Dry like the rock tree, which, if you're familiar with the text, is sort of a really significant natural feature that leads to a pretty big discovery in the novel. The cliff edge and also the dry riverbed. So she noted those in her responses. As can be seen, some of these responses provide a generative starting point from which to consider the significance of drought, habitat, and its entanglement in place. As discussed already, the relationship between nature and place is complex, and I see readers' engagement with different ideas of natural place as a particularly significant outcome of the study. Many readers of the eco-crime texts have understood this term natural place as representative of the bush primarily, but also of more built environments, we might say, that seem to be more of a product of settler colonialism, like particular farming landscapes and rural townships. The relationship between these latter places and environmental phenomena such as drought, bushfire and flood perhaps explains this. These might be human, particularly settler colonial, places that the readers are reflecting on, but they exist in relation to the natural places and the phenomena that surround and permeate them. Thus, some of the responses in this study are reflecting this complicated connection between place, nature, as well as crime and violence, showing how readers perhaps felt invited to reflect on their own conceptualizations of place and nature, even if inadvertently, and consider the multiple possibilities of place and its relationship to the non-human, and also how this is factored into violent crime. And I'll point back to that connection that one reader made between climate fiction and domestic violence, or if not an overt connection, just the fact of mentioning it in that sentence together I thought was particularly significant. So another common theme, of course, that I've already mentioned in readers' responses was how they talked about things like drought, as well as bushfire and flooding, but I'm going to talk mainly about drought today. So drought and fire both play a significant role in Harper's narrative and seem to strongly shape the experience of the survey participants who read it. All of the novels in this study address these themes in a variety of ways. And while the dry may not overtly explore climate change or overtly mention it, I should say, its striking portrayal of the ruinous impacts of drought and bushfire speaks volumes about the future reality of climate catastrophe for many Australians and the links between this and violent crime and socioeconomic upheaval. Many readers of The Dry commented on the significance of drought, its familiarity to Australians, and its overarching impact on rural Australian towns. One particularly striking response came from an editor in Victoria who described the following: I find books that describe the Australian landscape give me a yearning feeling. I love nature and enjoy imagining the descriptions in books, but I'm particularly affected by well-crafted Australian descriptions. For example, Tim Winton, Jasper Jones, and The Dry. I can hear sticks cracking under my feet, smell the wood smoke, and feel the driving rain on my face. Similarly, a sessional teacher from Victoria wrote the following: there were frequent references to the dry land, described with reference to trees, roads, crops, livestock, and people. The dry theme was strong and impactful throughout. The parched natural landscape was a powerful component of the narrative. These examples are just some of many that reflect on the depiction of drought and bushfire in these texts, with some participants, like the one I've just mentioned here, pondering how the dry affects not only livestock and people, but trees and this broader landscape as well. One response that struck me as particularly attuned to the ecological considerations of the novel, of The Dry, was one provided by the aforementioned housewife in Victoria, who noted that there was room for both the really breathtaking beauty of nature and a kind of fear of the unforgiving character of the natural world. Nature is very present and so much bigger than the people and unconcerned for them. Nature is kind of an alien other, which I thought was really interesting. So in some ways, this reflection evokes a partly perhaps eco-centric perspective, we might say, in its suggestion that the non-human exists externally to the human, even if in devastating ways, and even if said non-human phenomena, such as drought and bushfire, may be intensified by human actions. So in some ways, this response is assigning a kind of agency to the non-human. However, this assertion that the Australian non-human is an alien other, of course, also exemplifies a still largely prevalent colonialist ideology of the Australian natural world as an other in need of control. Marcia Langdon describes how Australian settler colonial culture encourages, quote, the dominion of civilisation over nature, and an understanding of nature as the other can result in an exacerbation of this dominion. And Stephen Knight, who's written a lot on Australian crime fiction, also says similar things, talks about this idea of dominion over nature, but also in a lot of settler colonial crime fiction, nature is often set up as this, I guess, alien other that is like the judge and jury or the avenger that comes in and gives justice to people if the detective or the the justice system is unable to do that in the context of the narrative. So it's either an alien other that is, supposed to be dominated by the settler colonizer, or it's going to come in as this sort of alien avenger that's able to action justice. Consequently, this reader's interpretation of the text as demonstrating both complex human-non-human relations and an othering view of nature as alien affirms that Harper's text brings important perspectives on the cause and effect relationship between humans and non-humans to the fore, but also upholds problematic settler colonial perspectives on nature and the non-human. So if I've got, what's the time? Well, the time's not on that. I don't know why I'm... Oh, okay. Look, I'll finish up in a moment, but I just wanted to finish with a bit of a comment on how people responded to animals, because I think this is quite interesting. So in addition to people's thoughts on drought, one of the most notable findings to come out of this study is how participants responded to the representation of non-human animals in these texts, or more specifically, how they didn't respond. Only about 12% of the eco-crime reader group described particular depictions of animals in their chosen texts. So whether they'd read The Dry or Scrublands, the vast majority of readers didn't reflect on the representation of animals at all. This could perhaps be related to the fact that both eco-crime texts do not focus on animals. It's about the human. Although, as discussed in a moment, animals still play roles in these narratives. But it could also indicate that readers are more likely to feel a connection to place than to particular species or individual animals. Some readers did take the time to reflect on the fact that there was an absence of animals in their selected text. A software developer from Victoria who'd read Scrublands wrote that, quote, curiously, there wasn't any real depiction of any animals. Hammer actually highlights in his narrative that animals and plants are few and far between in the drought-stricken landscape, describing how, quote, the cattle yard is empty of cattle and grass and any other living thing. Even the flies have abandoned it. The text's portrayal of a lack of non-human animals emphasises the harsh impacts of catastrophic drought in rural communities, in many ways drawing more attention to the plight of the non-human animal by highlighting their absence. As evidenced by the results of the study, though, readers, apart from a few of them, did not feel a need to reflect on the absence in their responses, indicating that their attention was not drawn to this aspect of the novel. It's also notable that very few participants specifically commented on the descriptions of animal cruelty in both crime texts. The Dry contains a confronting scene with a mutilated calf. So content warning here. I'm just going to very briefly not go into detail about it, but I do mention animal cruelty here. And Scrublands describes an equally brutal killing of a cat. The housewife from Victoria who'd read The Dry stated that, quote, every time there were animals in the story, they were being misused by people, shooting rabbits, cruelly shearing sheep, the calf that got its throat cut and left on Falk's doorstep. A public library employee in Victoria referred to the senseless killing of a cat and drought-affected stock in Scrublands. A retiree in Queensland who read Scrublands recalled the dead animals mentioned throughout the novel and stated that such depictions revealed, quote, how hard it was to be owners of livestock in dry times and how humans relate to animals in different ways, including cruelty. Apart from these responses, though, no other readers commented directly on the representation of animal cruelty. And it's difficult to pinpoint why this might be, although the texts focus on intrahuman crime and violence. It may be key here. And I do just want to finish up by talking about people who mentioned flies, because this was probably the main animal that was mentioned, which is perhaps unsurprising. And this is not just in terms of the animal itself, but the general atmosphere suggested by their presence in a hot rural Australian town marked by crime. So a marketing executive from Victoria who read The Dry wrote that, quote, I've felt the suffocating heat and the flies that can only come from an Australian town. And when asked whether there were any particular narrative events regarding animals, plants, or natural places that prompted this feeling, they simply responded with the flies, the damn flies. A research fellow from Victoria mentioned the ever-present flies in the dry and how they resonated with them, while a dental assistant in Queensland who'd also read the dry recalled, quote, the opening scene of flies swarming over arid countryside and drawn to the bodies of the murdered family. This connection between flies and death in the dry was also noted by a teacher from Victoria who described how, quote, the heat and the flies at the funeral, so the funeral of the Hadler family, who were the primary victims in the dry, was visceral. And so I think it's quite notable here that they're not necessarily just talking about the flies as an animal, but the cultural capital that the fly has, particularly in Australian crime fiction, particularly in rural settings and in the outback. So the fly is not just an animal in their own right, but are culturally construed to represent the supposed harshness of the land and the aridity of the Australian continent. So while further research is needed to better articulate what themes resonate with readers of Australian eco-fiction, particularly those who may not be environmentally inclined, this study reveals that readers can experience strong feelings about the non-human as depicted in Australian eco-crime fiction, and that this non-human is likely to be drought or other non-human phenomena such as bushfire and floods, which I haven't gone into today, but these were also remarked upon by some people in the study. The fact that some participants shared personal memories of places in Australia whose landscapes and natural surroundings were represented also demonstrates the role of relatability in reader response to environmental themes. Significantly, this finding emphasises the importance of local narratives if literature is to be an effective tool to encourage more environmental awareness and sympathetic behaviour, if we want to say that that is the job of literature, which it isn't necessarily. In particular, the reader responses in this study make clear that it is reader familiarity with and memories of particular environments which makes them powerfully evocative. And I just wanted to end with a note that there is research, including by Matthew Schneider-Mason, who I've quoted quite a bit in this paper actually, on a text like The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi, which is a US novel and hasn't been marketed as crime fiction, but is described by Schneider-Mason as, quote, a pulpy, hard-boiled and often violent thriller. And in terms of how it appeals to a broad audience and how it looks at crime elements and the connection between violence, climate change and water availability. And Gold Fame Citrus is another similar text. So I guess if I was to do this study again, or in a new way with more of a focus on crime fiction, I'd be really interested in comparing responses to Australian crime fiction and crime fiction in the US, or climate fiction, or I guess climate fiction, as Stuart King will write, crimate fiction. How do you pronounce it? Climate, like, yeah, of course you would. I have a tendency to say climate fiction in the US that has these strong crime fiction themes, but is also, excuse me, climate fiction. And there's also a burgeoning subgenre, I guess, of crime fiction, First Nations crime fiction, such as the Cash Black Bear series in the US, as well as some First Nations crime fiction here in Australia, which I think deserves more attention in a scholarly context. And so actually doing a survey that maybe includes more of these kinds of texts, a larger array of Australian crime fiction, is something that I'm possibly interested in doing in the near future. So thanks very much for listening. I'll finish up there.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a fascinating talk. I'm now going to open up the seminar to any questions people might have, whether online. Yeah, if you're responding, please keep that on, whether online or in the room. Ali.
Got lots of questions, but got the big comments anyway. It's just super interesting. Really, really glad to see that, genre being taken seriously, which is, of course, what Stuart and co would do. So kind of interested in the sort of the question of affect and response, and the way you think that I suppose the responses could be more contradictory and complex than the message of a text, or indeed the ideological beliefs that people bring. So, I mean, as you say about the Australian class study, I mean, there are real limitations, right? We're talking about middle class, middle age, hyper-educated
Mm.
teal voters.
Yep, yep.
They like the environment, and
Yeah.
therefore they're going to respond, give the kind of responses to give. Although to me, the most interesting one is the housewife who talks about the absolute alien otherness of nature.
Yeah.
Which I disagree with everybody who says that's a colonial idea. That's in fact deep ecological thing in itself. Nature is noumenon, which is absolutely beyond comprehension. That's a wonderfully sophisticated response, in my opinion. But at any rate, I'm just wondering, in what ways is it possible to, and I think about it in terms of my own interest in horror genre, in what ways is it interested to gauge responses that could be contradictory, both vis-a-vis the ideology of the respondent, e.g., I'm a teal voter, but after reading this book, I realize I fucking hate nature, for example.
Yeah, right.
And B, in what ways could they be against the ideology of the text itself? And if I don't mind, I will shut up shortly, but I don't know if you're familiar with Carol Clover's famous study of horror.
No.
Chainsaws.
No,
It's
but
really awesome. Because she assumed that, this is about horror cinema, slasher horror cinema of the 80s. She assumed that, oh, this is all misogynist killing of women, men going there to get off on seeing women killed. She was shocked to go and sit in a theater of a slasher film and see all the teenage boys jump up with joy to cheer on the final girl.
Yeah,
She
awesome.
coined the term final girl as she defeats and kills the slasher at the end.
Yeah, great.
She's the dorkiest, least sexually active female, and she's the sole survivor. And so she wrote a book about it, and she said, I'm as surprised as everybody else about the response of these viewers. So I'm just wondering, that was probably more of a comment. But
No, I think it's
sort of, is that sort of thing helpful? Or if you have any feedback for me as I do my own kind of thinking about my genre.
No, that's super helpful because, I mean, interestingly, the project or the study that I wanted to do, which as often happens with PhDs, it didn't end up happening for various reasons, but I wanted to do a before and after study. So I wanted to actually sort of do some intensive, like, I guess it's kind of book group or reading group style conversations with different demographics of people, or trying to bring together, I guess, a demographic of people that isn't necessarily the reading class either, depending on whether that would be feasible or not. And actually, yeah, look a little bit more ideologically, as in, like, what did you think about nature and the non-human or whatever, or settler colonialism before you read this text? Do you feel differently after? Is the your feelings around the affective nature of the text? I mean, not necessarily asking them these things, but asking them questions around how they feel about the text, and then trying to see how they align or don't align ideologically, as whether that's feasible or not in terms of how people actually respond to those kind of ideologically driven questions would be really interesting. But that's something I'd love to do. And I was about to say something else, but it slipped my mind. But yeah, I think that example of the horror genre particularly is another popular genre, and the ideological cultural capital of popular genre texts, I think, is something that is more and more studied, as it's saying, Stuart's doing that, you're doing that. But I think it's still, I mean, would you agree that it's still largely misunderstood, right? Like, there's a lot of assumptions being made around like that link between effect and ideology, right? Yeah, which is exactly what you said. Yeah. So I'd love to delve into that more. Thank you.
Any other questions? And I just want to apologize. I just realized we hadn't shared the slides for the presentation.
Oh, that's all right. I can
my apologies.
send them around. That's all right.
We can add them to the recording.
Hopefully my voice wasn't too boring.
Any further questions? Carlos.
My question's much shorter than Ali, and also you can say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no to all my questions. The first is, if you ask in the demographic questions, if you ask if any of the readers were Indigenous or not. If you had, the second question is if you had an Indigenous reader or not, and the third one is if anybody Indigenous or not, when you ask them about the feelings that natural places prompted, did anybody make the connection with the fact that Australia is a settler, colonial settler society?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, look, no, and that was probably the other thing. I think I was asked this question previously with this study, that we didn't ask those demographic questions, which is something I would do differently next time, because that would certainly be important. And also, like, some people in some of the responses kind of I don't think anybody self-identified as Indigenous, although some people self-identified as, I think, white settler, talking about the impacts on that, but more so with texts like Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, which was another one where they were sort of talking about, you know, the effect that text had on them as a non-Indigenous person. But yeah, unfortunately, no one that I know who identified themselves as Indigenous, so I couldn't comment on that, unfortunately. But yeah, something to do differently if I do this kind of survey again, I think. Yeah, for memory, there were a couple of non-Indigenous respondents who did. Like, again, it was more so with the Swan Book and maybe with Catherine McKinnon's Storyland, and less so with the crime text. But I do recall at least, not a lot, but there were at least a couple of responses that made that connection between sort of their own identity as white settler and the impacts of settler colonialism and climate change. So there were a couple, not an overwhelming number, but there were a couple, yeah.
Is that on?
Oh, yeah, I can hear. Yeah.
Very short question, just 2 questions. I'm wondering, I realize that this study was done before 2022.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about this comment that one of the respondents had made about climate fiction and domestic violence, and what do you think of a text like Briony Doyle's Echolalia, who I believe is your colleague as well?
Yeah, sure.
Had any
Yeah.
thoughts about that?
I haven't actually read Echolalia, so I'm so sorry. I've read The Island Will Sink, which I do love, but I haven't read Echolalia. But I think that would be something that I'd like to focus in more on in another study, just given, I mean, I guess not just Briony Doyle's book, but other texts at the moment that are really looking at the connection between climate change, domestic violence. Storyland by Catherine McKinnon looks at that a little bit, actually. And just, yeah, what readers would make of that. And, you know, more than just, you know, that example of the reader who mentioned climate change and domestic violence in the same sentence, but actually seeing where the readers would make that connection a little bit more strongly and think through, well, what are actually kind of the everyday crime implications of something like climate change, right? Because I don't know if they've yet done a study in Australia. I know they've done a study, I think it might be in Nigeria, of the connection between rising, you know, extreme heat waves and drought, and increase in not just domestic violence, but other forms of violence, and actually seeing them match up, right? So higher heat rates equal higher levels of violence and higher levels of crime. And they haven't done that in an Australian context, but there are a lot of fiction texts that are actually looking into that, right, as you mentioned with Briony Doyle's work. So it would be really interesting to expand on that in a survey form, I guess. Does that, sorry, sort of answer your question? Yeah. Sure. Oh, yeah. That's yeah, absolutely. That's a really good example, actually. It would be really cool to do visual media as well, and that's a good one. Thank you. I'd forgotten about that film. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
We've got 2 questions online. We've got Eric first.
Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that talk. This is a bit of a selfish question, so feel free just to take a pass on it if it falls outside of your area of interest. You mentioned Outback Noir as a genre or a form of writing, and I wondered if you could just say a few more words about that, and maybe specifically what makes it noir, and if there are any big names in Outback Noir that I should be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, Outback Noir is a tricky one, because I guess it's the Dry, I guess, would count as Outback Noir. The Scrublands was sort of writing, or Chris Hammer's been writing into that as well. There's, what's the one? I think Margaret Hickey writes a little bit into that as well. There's definitely a few authors I could not off the top of my head, but I could send you a list. But I think the difficulty with Outback Noir, and in terms of whether it is actually noir or not, is the term's become a bit of a, I guess, a catch-all thing for a lot of Australian crime fiction. And I think it's quite limiting, particularly in the sense that it's really, a lot of people writing into Outback Noir tend to be white settler authors. And so kind of like what I was saying about the Dry and Scrublands, they're kind of often replicating settler colonial literary conventions in their work, which isn't to say that that work shouldn't be published or anything like that, but it's not necessarily doing anything new in terms of it's often replicating kind of the rural Australian town as this place of oppressiveness, of starkness, of violence, and is not necessarily attending to the connections between that kind of violence or that kind of environmental exploitation and the city. So that's kind of the critique I would level at Outback Noir, and that's what I'm interested in expanding on in the other work I'm doing at the moment is some crime fiction texts, particularly First Nations crime fiction texts like Meduka, the River Serpent, as well as Melissa Lukashenko's Too Much Lip, which isn't categorized as crime fiction per se, but I think is a lot more attentive. Like I wouldn't categorize them as Outback Noir because I think they're more attentive to not this quintessential outback, but actually looking at rural and regional Australia as like products or as related to settler colonialism and the effects of settler colonialism on people and the environments, and linking that in with the city as like this imperial centre, right, that kind of gets to dictate how crime and justice are dealt with in rural regional areas, and not necessarily giving agency to rural regional areas. I mean, why it's called noir, I mean, I don't know, Stuart, can you weigh in on that a little bit more as someone who's probably more well-versed in that?
I'll say something controversial here. I don't think
it is
the Dry is noir, and I
Yeah.
don't think it's actually the outback. It's set in
You're right.
It's set in Victoria in the
Yeah.
Wimmera region, and there is nothing outback about that part of the world. It's slightly remote in relation to the rest of well, to Melbourne, for example, but it's not really. But it's not outback.
No, you're right. Yeah.
It's the whole noir thing just becomes this, as you know, Eric, often becomes a catch-all phrase. And there was the Nordic noir, so they were trying to. I think it's a marketing ploy by publishers to go, we've got the noir of Nordic noir, which is kind of sexy, and we'll do an Australian version of it.
That's the vibe.
And the outback just suggests, brightness, I suppose, as opposed to the darkness of the of Nordic noir.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Thanks, Stuart.
Next question from
it's Fiona Wade. Yeah, it's Fiona Wade.
Sure.
Yeah, calling. I don't know why I've got my old name up there. It's really weird.
Okay.
Hi, Rachel. I'm actually doing work with Eleanor Gardner, who I understand you did your PhD with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, great.
yeah. So we're looking at crime fiction and domestic violence, and the actual lack of representation within commercial crime fiction of domestic violence, considering that domestic violence is such a prevalent issue within our society. But one of the things I wanted to raise with you is I was speaking in another forum, and someone made the comment about climate change causing domestic violence. And I actually, I'm going to use a very academic term, poo-pooed the idea.
Okay.
Not so much because it doesn't cause it, but you'll see in a range of academic settings that crisis will increase violence and domestic violence. So in other words, yes, it can, but it's a long, like only financial crisis can cause a rise in domestic violence, and having sick children can cause a rise in sickness. There's a whole range. So I kind of feel rather bad now about poo-pooing that climate change is about rise in domestic violence. But one of the things I was going to say is that we've actually, Ellie and I have found very, very few Australian crime fiction novels that deal with domestic violence that don't actually make the perpetrator or the victim turn out to be raging vigilantes or so it's actually really interesting that, considering that domestic violence is our most common crime, with 400. I'm in New South Wales, 400 domestic violence reported each week in New South Wales, and yet there is such a limited look at domestic violence within crime fiction. So that's what we're going to be speaking at the conference.
That's a really great point, and it's something I think I talked about briefly in an expanded, a different paper about the dry, and I think Sue Turnbull has written about this too with the dry. But something that I find interesting is that for those of you who haven't read the dry or seen the film, like the family, the Hadlers. So as I said earlier, it's supposed to have been a murder-suicide. So he's supposed to have, supposedly been dealing with drought and economic hardship, and he's supposed to have murdered his wife and child and then killed himself. But then the big reveal is that it wasn't a murder-suicide. It was this other guy coming in and trying to deal with gambling.
Wasn't it the headmaster or the head teacher?
Yeah, the headmaster of the school. Yeah, sorry, spoiler.
Yes.
But I just assume everyone's read it or seen it. It turns out to be somebody else. And I think I know there's been some criticism. I can't remember if someone commented on this in my survey, actually, or whether I'm getting it confused with what I read in maybe a newspaper review. But it's sort of, even though it's the narrative, right, it's sort of, and even though the Luke Hadler, the father, isn't actually, a domestic violence perpetrator, and that's the reveal, it kind of pushes that narrative to the side a little bit and sort of says, oh,
that's right.
He didn't end up being that man that we all thought he was, and that's great.
And interestingly, and interestingly too, in some of the other books that do have domestic violence, it's almost like it's like a on the side thing. It's a bit of a takeaway thing. I mean, okay, Jane Caro's. I'm not going to comment on how it's written, but Jane Caro's mother, is domestic violence. It's very obviously domestic violence, but still, again, she becomes vigilante.
Really? Okay.
And also, what's quite interesting is that a lot of the novels are all set in regional or remote areas of Australia. They're not, and domestic violence is perpetrated anywhere, but there's not a lot that are actually written in the city. So it's interesting.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I've been meaning to email Ellie, actually, so maybe I'll send her an email and that sounds really interesting.
We'd like to speak. Yeah, we'd like to talk to you offline about a few things.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. That's a great point.
Can I take Chair's prerogative to ask a final question?
Sure.
And well, it's not so much is it a final question? Going back to the question of the human versus the non-human, it's interesting that the in the drive, for example, it is a crime, and this is going to sound so ridiculous that you'll think I'm an idiot. It is a crime to, you're facing the experience of drought and economic hardship, so you decide to kill your family and commit suicide. That is considered to be a crime. But if you murder all your animals,
right,
perfectly acceptable. You've got the same cause, which is provoked one murder, and the other one is legitimate, and the other one isn't. I don't know if anybody commented on that.
No, they didn't. I think I would remember if they did, because that would have been a really
significant comment. Can I jump into
comment.
that too? And can I jump in and say, actually, interestingly, animal cruelty is a precursor to domestic violence.
Right, and there's that, because in the dry, there's that memory that Aaron Falk has of Luke Hadler when they're a kid, where he thinks he's maybe like strangled his rabbit or something, and he doesn't really know, but he's sort of trying to connect the dots and be like, well, if he was the kind of person to do that, then of course he's the kind of person to murder his own family. So it's right. Often used in that sense, But no, unfortunately, there was no one that made that point about what is considered a criminal act and what isn't.
That's something which comes out in Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, for example.
Right, okay,
What is a crime in relation to the non-human?
Great.
From animals to insects.
How interesting.
It raises a lot of interesting questions.
That's
but with that, thank you everybody for coming. Those of you online who outnumbered us this time.
Yeah, thank you.
We're maybe sort of even for a while. But thank you very much, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
For attending and for agreeing to have this lecture recorded. So.
No, that's okay. Thanks very much for having me and thanks for listening.